Hi guys, welcome back to another video. Today is one that I have been wanting to make for a very long time. So a little bit of backstory. Silent Hill 2 is probably one of my favorite video games of all time. I ranked it a 9 out of 10 when I first played it. It only lost out on like a top spot because of some very minor glitches. I played the HD collection, so fair enough. And in October 2024, a remake of this game finally released. Now, I was always team optimistic from the start. I know a lot of people were really hating on the footage of this game that we got, but I really enjoyed the trailers that they were releasing, and with each new one that came out, I got more and more excited for the game. I did end up being a few months late to the party, and I only just got to play and finish the Silent Hill 2 remake. But do I think the game as a whole was a worthwhile remake, and do I think it lives up to the original? That's what we are going to touch on today, so stick around if you want to hear my thoughts about the game and just how it compares to its PS2 counterpart. As always, these are just my thoughts and opinions, and I would love to hear your opinions on the game down in the comments below, just as long as you know that you cannot change my mind about this game. And as always, the footage here shown is from my very own playthrough, so if you would like to see the whole playthrough of this game and see my raw reactions to it, the playlist will be linked in the description down below, and there should be a card popping up for you in the top right here as well. Now, without further ado, let's get into the video. I have quite a lot of thoughts about this game overall, so I figured it would be easier if we broke this down into a couple of sections. So let's start off firstly with the visuals. Now, of course, in a time span of 20 years, there are going to be a lot of expected visual upgrades in video games in general, but this game is so gorgeous. I played the PS5 version and I had my game set to fidelity mode, and honestly I think a good portion of my run through was me just like looking around and really taking everything in. Just from like when it loaded in and that starting area where James is going over the letter from Mary, everything just looks incredible. Like, I was walking down that little mountain trail and I was like so giddy for the game. And even right to the end of this game, I never got over how it looked. I genuinely think, just even on the PS5 in general, this is one of the best looking games on that platform. All of the walls look like wet and fleshy, which is gross, but it works. And the fog was done really well as well. It's still like really dense, but not so much that it completely obscures your vision. And the lighting engine especially as well, everything just looks so gloomy and dark. And I think as well the characters look really, really good, which just so happens to be our next topic. This was probably one of the biggest doubts that the community had going into the launch of this game. I know James and Angela especially copped a lot of slack about how they looked in this new game. And James even had a little bit of a redesign, which I do think was for the best. But honestly, I think everyone looked great. There was still that little bit of like uncanniness about some of the characters, but I don't necessarily think that's the game's fault. I feel like we're just getting to that point in video games where the characters are looking so realistic that sometimes things just feel a little bit off. I think out of everyone, Laura's facial animations were probably the weakest, but James and Maria especially looked so good. The motion capture is probably one of my favorite things about this game in general, as well as the voice acting, which we will get to. But whenever a cutscene played, I just kept completely quiet and I couldn't help but just pay so much attention during these interactions. Like the tiny little facial details in James, like his eyes darting around, his pupils dilating, and like the little mouth twitching and the hand shaking. You can really see that like uncertainty in his head, like portrayed on his physical face, and everything just feels so uneasy and it's great. I think that's one thing that the original game really lacked, which of course is not the game's fault. It was simply just not possible at the time, but like being able to see the emotions on someone's face as they are speaking that emotion, I think just does so much for the vibe of the game. Now, going back to the voice acting, everyone knows that the voice acting in the original game has been a touchy subject for a little bit, and it's this age-old argument of whether they were stilted on purpose or if it was just bad acting. And honestly, I think it's probably a mix of both, but either way, whatever it is, it has become one of Silent Hill's most recognizable traits. You'd finally find and get to speak to a real person in the game, and it almost felt like a reward for fighting through all these monsters, and then more often than not, you'd leave that conversation with just more questions than when you started. And obviously having that original voice cast back just wasn't gonna happen, so either way, people were probably still gonna be unhappy about the new cast, but I think it's probably the best it could have turned out. Some of the emotions in the line delivery is a little different, but overall I think the tone of everything is definitely still there. All of the cast did such an amazing job, and just the characterization of how they've done each person in this version is, again, one of my favorite things about this game. Most of the dialogue in those important cutscenes and interactions is almost word for word as well, which made me so much happier than I can express. If you watch me play the game through, you'll just see I have this dumb look on my face when like a sentence or a letter is read out almost identically to the original. And Maria especially, I think, had my favorite interactions. Every time she had a sequence with James, I was just so excited to see how it was going to play out. They've done a really good job with everyone's characterization and how they portray these emotions and these feelings within these interactions. And they've just added a lot of new interactions with the characters as well, mostly with Maria. When she like follows you around the town, she'll sort of comment on what you're doing, and her and James have a little bit of banter. Like if you smash glass on a car, she acts like audibly surprised that you did that. Or if you are taking a little bit long to explore and going in the wrong direction, like I did, she will comment on it, and I will tell her to shut up. For the most part, this game is incredibly faithful to that original one. Most of the environments, camera angles, the dialogue interactions are all the same, but there are a few sequences that have been changed. One that probably stood out to me initially was the Bowl-O-Rama, where normally in the original you'd find Eddie and Laura sharing a pizza, discussing the monsters, and James makes that comment about how someone could possibly be eating pizza. So I walked into the bowling alley and all I found was an empty pizza box and no Eddie. And I was honestly a little bit upset at this at first because I was worried that that meant they were gonna get rid of a lot of these key interactions that I think were really important for the feeling of the game. But instead, I found out about this little like flashback system. You interact with the pizza box and James still gets to say his original line, and there's even an achievement tied to it as well. So what this is instead is, while certain interactions have been cut, most of them have instead just been moved, but they've kept in pieces of that original, almost as little Easter eggs for people to find. So later on, you do get to see Eddie and Laura having almost the exact same interaction, but it's inside a movie theater instead. Or again, Maria with her outfit change when her and James are exploring a motel on the side of the road, which again is a brand new area. She finds her original outfit in a closet and makes a little comment asking James if he thinks she'd look good in it. And I really appreciated little sections like these because it made the game feel new enough, but it still kept in those classic lines for us that really wanted them. But speaking of things that have changed the most, it is time to talk about the gameplay. Now, at its core, this is still a survival horror game. Resources must be managed very carefully, and the combat feels just the right amount of challenging with not necessarily any reward to it. And a good majority of your time with this game is going to be spent just exploring and solving puzzles. But the flow of how this happens has been changed quite a bit. So firstly, with the combat, you no longer just hold down an action button and stun lock your enemy into submission. There's a little bit more to focus on now, and it reminded me a lot of how the Resident Evil remakes changed around the combat. So melee is still preferred, but the enemies now do a much better job at making sure you don't get comfortable with just mashing the attack button. They're a lot more agile now. They sway around quite wildly to throw off your aim if you're trying to use a gun. And the enemies all have their own little combos now that can even attack you multiple times. So it means that each enemy will have their own combat patterns, and learning these patterns and how each enemy handles is going to be very important to the combat. They've also added in a new dodge move, which I will admit, I, amongst many other people, was skeptical of this dodge move, and I was worried how it would impact the fear that comes from the monsters. But I do have to say, even with the dodge move, it never felt like you were more in control or had the upper hand. It needs pretty decent timing, and it can be really hard to judge distance sometimes, to the point where you might dodge that first hit from an enemy, but then you'll still get hit with their second or their third. And all the way until the end of the game, I only just felt like I was really starting to get the hang of it, so I really don't think it takes away from the tension that much. I played on easy, and I was able to stock up quite a lot of ammo for that pistol, just like in the original. I had a few hundred, but the shotgun and the rifle bullets were still proving quite difficult to find. I only really saved them for boss encounters, and even then, they would knock me to zero quite often. Most of these boss encounters as well play out pretty similarly to begin with, but then each boss had added in like a second phase that's unique to each one. So Flesh Lips, for example, still hangs from the ceiling and is just a nice little shooting target for James, but then eventually once you deal enough damage, it'll drop down and use its metal cage almost like legs to run around and attack you with. Abstract Daddy again just starts as run to the corner of the room and shoot to chip away his health. But then as the fight continues, you have to more so move around the apartment, track him down, and deal damage to him until he's had enough. Even the final boss fight with Mary has had a couple of these changes thrown in as well, and there's even a little bonus mini boss fight with a closer in the hotel section. All the boss fights were generally the same in spirit, but they required a lot more strategy, and you can no longer basically just stand in a corner and shoot. Which that whole idea has carried over to all the enemies. They feel almost the same as the original, but they just require a little bit more strategy as to working out how you're going to approach each enemy, especially in group encounters, and I think that's what they've done well about keeping the survival horror in the game. And alongside the combat, like we discussed, there is also a lot of puzzles and exploration. Now, the locations and the maps of the game are laid out basically identically, but the way you progress through each area has almost completely been changed. When you first enter Silent Hill, your initial thought is just wander around, collect some of the supplies that are lying on the streets, and then you get your key to enter the apartment building. But now they've made it so you can actually go into and explore a lot of these buildings, not only for extra ammo, but there's actually a bunch of side quests around that you need to complete to even get that key to begin with. And there's like whole extra puzzles that you need to solve in that area as well. They have kept in certain puzzles, like the coin puzzle in the apartments, but now they have extra steps to them, like you have to turn the coin multiple times to solve multiple riddles. Then there's other puzzles, like the triple locked box in the hospital that's just been replaced with a different puzzle entirely, but that box itself is still kept in as one of those little flashback features. Overall, this is probably just one of my main issues with the game, is that some of these sections I think went on a little bit too long with all of the new additions. Like the labyrinth section, especially with that rotating head puzzle, instead of just doing it once, you now need to do it 3 times to clear 3 separate areas to get the item you need to progress. So I do like how you have to explore a little bit more, and you especially get to spend a lot more time in the streets of Silent Hill itself, which I do really enjoy. The new puzzles were still a good amount of challenging. They were straightforward enough that you sort of knew what to do after you thought about it for a minute, but they weren't always super obvious to begin with. But just having all of these extra puzzles, some of them, again, like that labyrinth section especially, did just feel a little bit like filler and padding, and I think they could have been cut down a tad. That would have helped with the pacing a lot. So, after going through and having a look at all of that, I think it's probably pretty obvious what my thoughts on this game are. So do I think it's a worthwhile remake? Absolutely. Whether you are a fan of the PS2 classic, or if you're a newcomer to the series, I think that this is a must-play Silent Hill game. I genuinely cannot give Konami, and especially Bloober, enough praise for keeping the story and integrity of the game so intact, but making the experience also feel much more robust and rewarding for returning players. But still, looking back and comparing the two, I don't know if I can actually put the remake above the original game. I think for me, they're both going to remain tied with each other at a 9 out of 10, simply because that charm of the classic and just how groundbreaking it was cannot be understated. And again, probably my one complaint with the PS5 remake is its runtime did feel a little bit bloated in some sections, but I would 100% play this game again, and I think that it is going to become a classic in its own right. So, that's it! I absolutely loved this game, and it honestly made me feel a type of way that I have not felt in a very long time getting to play a video game. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Be sure to leave a like if you did, it really does help me out, and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this in the future, as well as a lot more horror content coming from me as well. I do eventually plan on playing through every single mainline Silent Hill title at some point in the future as well, so this will definitely make it into that ranking. But that is all from me. So until next time everyone, stay safe, have a wonderful time zone, and goodbye!